Hello! Today I'm going to be talking about a very special book, one of the most unique things I have ever read, and a book that is very near and dear to my heart, the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa, a Portuguese author, translator, philosopher. He was many things, and he was many people. And it is essential in prefacing discussion of any work of Pessoa's that I explain what I mean by that. Over the course of his life, which seemed solely devoted to writing his literature, Pessoa invented over 70 of these unique personas that came with defined backstories and personalities, differing philosophies, and writing styles, which he would write through. He called these heteronyms, distinct from pseudonyms, more fleshed out and more distinct. Often he would write from the perspective of these heteronyms, and they would comment on each other's works, sometimes even translating each other's works. Dying at the age of 47 in 1935, Pessoa was not appreciated in his lifetime, and most of his work actually emerged posthumously. He was only able to publish, I believe, 4 books in English and 1 in Portuguese while he was alive. Upon his death, 2 enormous trunks of literature were discovered. Private writings that he kept and worked on over decades and never published. I believe the total sits at 25,574 pages, which are now archived. And the process of going through his entire life's work stored in these trunks is still going on. There have emerged Pessoa scholars who labor to decipher and interpret, categorize, classify, and publish his life's work. This is one of the most profound, enriching, introspective books I have ever read, and it will probably remain so until the day I die. It captures in this sort of perfect false lucidity what it is to have an internal life, living consummately through your dreams, a liminal space of unreality. I'm doing my best to grasp my true feelings about this book without relying on the same verbal crutches I always do. I think it's a huge disservice to use the same tired phrases I always do. I'm trying my best not to just stare off into infinity thinking about it. This book is a gross deluge of incredible writing, some of the best I've ever read in my entire life. It took me almost a year to the date to finish this book. Over the course of going through it very slowly, very carefully, rereading many passages over and over again, I've written down dozens and dozens of entries in this book, verbatim. I want to keep them with me wherever I go, even though I have to return this book. But before I stumble into this review further, I need to give you some more context about what the Book of Disquiet actually is. Though renowned for his many, many heteronyms, the Book of Disquiet only contains writings from 2 of them, Vincent Guedes and Bernardo Soares. This book is a quasi-autobiographical, semi-diary of sorts. Though Soares has a different personality and life and backstory invented entirely by Pessoa, they are kind of similar to one another. And in a way, the Book of Disquiet feels like it's Pessoa's own musings on life, his frustrations with it, the experience of tedium, his views on many subjects as filtered through an introverted lens, as well as his own grievances with the pursuit of art and his own writing process. The first half of the Book of Disquiet started around 1913, written from the perspective of Vincent Guedes, planned to, by Pessoa, be abandoned. He thought that he needed to restructure the whole book and reconsider what it was. He intended it to be one written over many years, and so more time passed after he abandoned the project as Guedes and picked it back up as Bernardo Soares. But I am really grateful for the first half of this book, that it wasn't abandoned and was included. Though the 2 heteronyms featured in this book do have different styles, they touch on a lot of the same ideas and share some of the same qualities of voice that give it something of a fragmented coherence. This book is so special because none of it ever really saw the light of day or was approved for publishing by Pessoa, who even muses in this very book about the frustration of trying to achieve like a perfect writing, how he'll never attain that, and how his attempt to do so in this book is already kind of a precluded failure. But it is without a doubt one of the greatest books ever written. Reading the Book of Disquiet really feels like you're peering directly into Pessoa's own creative process as much as you are actually reading his work. It has this incredibly uncanny quality to it. Like, this is a novel and works as a novel in some ways, if you approach it as something of a found document, a diary written in pieces. But it was also clearly intended to be a finished work which we will never see. It is in this imperfect form that Pessoa achieves true greatness. And when I call this book imperfect, I only do so holding it up to the standards that Pessoa undoubtedly held for himself. Because the writing in this book, across its 470 pages, is consistently jaw-dropping. The style of Guedes and Suarez as presented here is not easy to read. I think it is very deceptively easy to flow through. But if you are to truly relish what Pessoa has written here, it demands that you reread certain sentences, because Pessoa's use of language is incredibly particular. His use of paradox, of using antithetical language to say what he actually means, but in doing so, say it more truthfully. He often works in metaphor, and his prose is very abstract. It's romantic, but it's also got this incredibly curious, contradictory quality to it. He'll start with a premise and will follow it through this paradoxical, poetic language and arrive at an entirely different conclusion than he started with, and he'll acknowledge this. There are literally hundreds of perfect sentences in this book. And so it should impress you that any Pessoa scholar would take on translating his work. The process of doing so is outlined extensively in the introduction to this book, which is also fascinating to read, and touches on how Pessoa's particular style necessitated a slight deviation from his exact word choice. I am aware that I could be accused of straying too far from the original, but when faced by a sentence so complex as regards syntax and meaning, I felt I had no alternative but to reinvent the whole thing, while simultaneously, again, that paradox, keeping as close as possible to connotation, nuance, rhythm, and yes, oddity of phrasing or vocabulary. Pessoa's, Guedes, Suarez's prose, like all the best prose, forces the translator to stretch his or her own language to its limits and to mine his or her imaginative unconscious in order to find new ways to express meaning. That same process is one you as a reader go through. While I found it very tempting to let Pessoa's prose just wash over me, I had to examine these sentences time and time again to truly get at the metaphors he constructs. And I'm really grateful for taking the time to put in the work to meet his writing style on its own terms. And I think that speaks to the defining quality in my favorite works of art across mediums, that they demand something of me rather than being something that is digestible to my palate. I want to change and see new perspectives and grow and become more than I merely am, and the process of doing so is often one that is painful and hard and challenging and frustrating. You have to really process it and think and mull over what is being said. And so I found it rather difficult to get into a consistent rhythm reading this book, so it became something of a buffer read across the past year. I would get in passages where I could, I would read other things, I would read more passages, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. The structure of this book really rewards, and I think even incentivizes, bursts of engagement over time. It's almost like a little introvert devotional. So if this book sounds at all like something you would like to read, I would simply advise that no matter how fast or slow you find yourself naturally progressing, that you make sure to take the time to extract the most meaning you can from all that Pessoa has written here. I would not brush aside the sentences that trouble you. Some entries take up several pages with Pessoa really examining the central idea of the passage quite thoroughly, and some others are simply just a sentence. This reflects the flow of a natural writing process, one without a premeditated structure to better satiate the reader's desire for a consistent rhythm and balancing of its themes and ideas. It is simply a presentation of these writings as they came to Pessoa at the time. Though there are notes for revisions that Pessoa had intended for his work to be done as he approached the completion of the Book of Disquiet, which he never did. And there are other notes for some extra writings and poems to be included in other editions of the Book of Disquiet. Whatever version of this book you are reading, you will encounter a rhythm that is the product of it being an incomplete book. And this is why I felt the approach I took to reading this book to be pretty appropriate. Going through it sporadically, hitting a couple of entries at a time, picking up steam where there were shorter entries, and maybe only reading one a day if they ran on pretty long and I didn't have the time to go further. The assemblage of the Book of Disquiet was done chronologically. In the upper right-hand corner of some of these entries list the vague date, if there is not a specific one written in by Pessoa himself, to kind of draw a broad chronology. And there is a sequence to the book outside of simply the flow of time. I definitely felt, as I was approaching the end, that Bernardo Soares, and by extension Pessoa, were contemplating more morbid ideas about death. And it was hard not to feel, as I saw those markers approach the year 1935, that Pessoa himself was unconsciously approaching these topics with an awareness of his own mortality. While there are passages that touch on the idea that some people simply live very external lives, and the writing tinges these characters as more animal than human, in a way that almost seems to cast extroverts as something of a noble savage normie. There is, though acerbic, some anecdotal truth to that, in the sense that some people do not have the same reflective depth as others. Vincent Guedes and Bernardo Soares seem to have an infinite depth. Introspection that even rebounds upon itself, an awareness of the process of introspection. The book captures so pristinely to me the actual frustrated process of thinking. Though I have no doubt Pessoa anguished and labored over so many of the sentences, the unfiltered examination of our own thoughts and feelings is what makes the writing feel so profound. In reading this book, I was able to arrive at so many beautiful and sad epiphanies about what it is to live my life. Living part of it unconsciously and part of it intensely consciously creates sort of a dualism. Pessoa even comments that his words fail him in describing his own feelings sometimes. So while I feel you will see so much of your own self in the Book of Disquiet, you'll be able to relate on an even deeper level, and that is the frustration we experience in our own inability to understand ourselves, to truly grasp in our own fullness what we think and feel, to be unable to actually put those things to words, how all writing on this subject is a frustrated, failed effort, because it can only ever engage with the subject in an insubstantial medium. But again, with Pessoa's writing being so contradictory in nature, in its manner of elucidating truth, you will encounter passages that seem to perfectly voice thoughts and feelings that you have probably had before in a way that you have never been able to put to words, with a beauty and poetic depth that moves me greatly. Moving me in the sense that I'm now able to establish a greater sympathy to myself. And that is not to say that I share Bernardo Soares' perspective entirely. There are passages in this book where I disagree almost outright with what it is that is being said or argued here. I never felt that to be a shortcoming of the work, because Soares will, in many of these entries, disagree with himself openly. It is a work beautifully unafraid of committing some error in the dialectic we have with ourselves. Because the only true dialectic we are capable of is one filtered through our own human imperfection. Central to this book is the concept of dreams. Dreams both in a literal sense, that which occurs while we are sleeping, as well as dreams more in the context of maladaptive daydreaming, the illusory world of our own mind, one so many of us choose to inhabit more than the world we actually live in. The divide between the dream and our reality is explored in such a compelling way, in a way that does not register to me as a cliche. There were many fresh perspectives on this divide that I found. It's a book that maintains a very sad central philosophy, the decision to reject life, the decision to abstain from living to the fullest. If you've ever chastised yourself for your own shortcomings or how much you can get in your own head, if you're a particularly neurotic person, these feelings of frustration and being at war with the entire world for no reason, how we retreat into ourselves from the external world. Even within ourselves, we cannot escape tedium. Tedium that can just come unannounced. A sickness, a nausea, but also not that, and more than that at the same time. Tedium being one of the most universal existential pangs we all go through, but simply don't talk about enough. It is tedious to be alive. He reflects on all of these themes while weaving in beautiful romantic poetry. While I found myself generally more drawn to Guedes' writing style than Suarez, who leans more into these visual descriptions of interior landscapes, there were many passages of austere visual beauty to symbolically illustrate the internal processes within himself. Sometimes I do feel, especially in Suarez's section, that he indulges in this style a little too much for my taste. Sometimes rereading these sentences didn't quite yield the same insight as some of his other passages that seemed more focused on the central subject of its entry. While some were more lackluster than others, the ones that were really striking still stick with me. It's hard for me to call the Book of Disquiet anything less than a down-and-out masterpiece. It is a book I am promising myself now I will reread later on in my life if I don't die prematurely. In these pages you will find a sympathetic soul, someone who has suffered in not suffering, someone who grows tedious of their own tedium, someone who cannot even find escape in the dream. You will quickly get reacquainted with your life as you live it from within, and how that can be very painful and sad. Also how, in experiencing these feelings, voiced the way they are here, through the written word, we can exercise them and find a balm. It is this caliber of writing that I feel ill-equipped to actually talk about without doing it a disservice. And so I'm going to do the laziest thing a book reviewer can do, and I'm just going to read you my favorite passages from this book. I collected these over a period of a year, so I have, over the course of reading this book, reread many of these over and over. It has granted me an outer membrane of perspective that has enriched my life, and I want to share that with you. I, of course, first want you to read this book. If I can do anything in this review, it is to get somebody to read this book before I read it to you. But I don't think it really possible to sour your read of the Book of Disquiet in reading even a lot of it because of how much insight there is for you to explore. The passages you will come across when you read this book could vary greatly from the ones that I have taken away from this read. And I also believe that were I to pick this back up later in life, I would probably be drawn to other passages than I was this time around. The best service I can do it is to represent it directly. So the rest of this video is going to be just that, me narrating my favorite passages from the Book of Disquiet. I hope you enjoy, I hope you read this book, and thank you so much for watching.
All pleasure is a vice, because seeking pleasure is what everyone does in life, and the worst vice of all is to do what everyone else does. Giving value to one's own suffering gilds it with the golden sun of pride. Great suffering can give us the illusion of being pain's chosen one. I find no consolation even in pride. What reason have I to be proud if I am not the creator of myself? If I do not seek to live, to act, or to feel, it is, believe me, so as not to disturb the already laid down lines of my false persona. Why is art beautiful? Because it is useless. Why is life ugly? Because it is all aims and purposes and intentions. Taking dreams for reality, living too much in dreams, has left me with the thorn of this false rose, my dreamed life. For not even my dreams please me, because I find fault with them. Let us not be deceived, O veiled one, by our own tedium, because tedium itself grows old and does not fully dare to be the anxiety that it is. The art of the child is that of making things unreal. Blessed is that mischievous stage in life, when love is negated by the absence of sex, when reality is negated by play, treating as real things that are not. When I was a child, I wanted to be the queen on one of those old playing cards we had at home. I thought this was a truly compassionate, heraldic vocation. But when one is a child, one does have such moral aspirations. It's only later, when our aspirations are all immoral, that we think about this seriously. To dream is to confess to the necessity of living, replacing real life with unreal life, and thus it is a compensation for the inalienability of the will to live. My soul is weary of my life. All effort is pointless, but it passes the time. Reasoning is sterile, but amusing. Loving is tedious, but possibly preferable to not loving. The dream, however, replaces everything. In dreams, you can enjoy the idea of effort without actually having to make any effort. Some metaphors are more real than the people walking down the street. The truly wise man is the man who lets external events trouble him as little as possible. To do this, he needs to armor himself by surrounding himself with realities that are closer to him than those events, and through which the events reach him changes so as to accord with those realities. Any major effort takes time, and the time it takes travels through various states of our soul, and each of those states impresses its own particular personality on the individuality of the work. Only abstention is noble and lofty, because it is an acknowledgement that any work we might produce is inevitably inferior. The physical article is always the grotesque shadow of the dreamed work. In the eyes that avoid mine, I suspect a mockery I find only natural, aimed at the inelegant exception I represent in a world that takes pleasure in things and in activity, and, in the supposed depths of these physiognomies, I imagine and interpose an awareness of the timid nature of my life that prompts guffaws of laughter. After thinking this, I try in vain to convince myself that I alone am the source of this idea of other people's mockery and mild opprobrium. But once objectified in others, I can no longer reclaim the image of myself as a figure of fun. I feel myself grow suddenly vague and hesitant in a hothouse rife with ridicule and animosity. From the depths of their soul, everyone points a finger at me. Everyone who passes stones me with merry, scornful insolence. I walk among enemy ghosts that my sick imagination has conjured up and planted inside real people. Today I have only reality, and I cannot play with that. Poor child exiled in his manhood, why did I have to grow up? Today, when I remember this, I'm filled with nostalgia for other things too. More things have died in me than just my past. I would never know how to cajole my soul into persuading my body to possess yours. Even the thought of it makes me stumble over invisible obstacles inside me, to become entangled in unrecognizable webs. I belong to a generation, or rather, to part of a generation, that has lost all respect for the past and all belief or hope in the future. This is why we live in the present, with the desperate hunger of someone who has no other home. And since it is in our sensations, futile, frivolous sensations, especially in our dreams, that we find a present that reminds us neither of the past nor of the future, we smile at our inner life and, with a haughty somnolence, detach ourselves from the quantitative reality of things. My life is a continual fever, a never-quenched thirst. I find real life as oppressive as a very hot day. There's something rather humiliating about that. Man should not be able to see his own face. Nature gave him the gift of being unable either to see his face or to look into his own eyes. The creator of the mirror poisoned the human soul. Even my dreams punish me. I have achieved such a degree of lucidity in them that I perceive as real everything I dream, and so everything I dream thereby loses all value. To externalize impressions is more a way of persuading ourselves that we have them than actually having them. The reality, if any, of our sensations resides precisely in its otherness. Reality is made up of what is common and shared. That's why we as individuals only exist in the spurious part of our sensations. I have always found my awareness of suffering more painful than the suffering itself. Early on, the life of my emotions moved to the seat of thought, and there I enjoyed a broader emotional knowledge of life. Everything that man pronounces or expresses is a marginal note in a text that has been totally erased. From the meaning of the note, we can more or less work out the meaning of that vanished text, but there is always a doubt, and many possible meanings. It is human to want what we need, and it is human to want what we don't actually need but want. What is unhealthy is to want with equal intensity what is necessary and what is desirable, and to suffer as intensely, because our life is not perfect as we would if there were no bread. The romantic malaise is this: wanting the moon as if there were actually some way of getting it. Enjoying a painful truth, combining the pain of the wound with the balm of having understood the gods. The unreal disguise of consciousness serves only to emphasize to me the existence of the undisguised unconscious. From birth to death, man lives enslaved to the same external concept of self as do the animals. He does not live his life, he merely vegetates on a higher, more complex level. Any effort we make, regardless of the goal in view, will inevitably have to adapt to the changes imposed on it by life. It then becomes a different kind of effort, with different goals, and may even achieve the exact opposite of what it set out to achieve. Only a paltry goal is worth aiming for, because only a paltry goal stands any chance of being achieved. Everyone has a boss, always ready with some inappropriate joke and a soul out of touch with the universe. I dream because I dream, but I don't insult myself by giving to dreams a value they do not have, apart from that of being my own personal theater, just as I do not call wine food or one of life's necessities. Cafe humor divides itself into witty remarks about those who aren't there and insolent remarks made to those who are. This kind of wit is just plain rude. There is no clearer indicator of poverty of spirit than a person's inability to be funny except at other people's expense. A nothing that seems to breathe, a little death from which one wakes feeling fresh and revived, a yielding of the fibers of the soul as it is massaged by oblivion. And with an abrupt gesture, like someone at last finding the resolve to kill himself, I throw off the heavy bedclothes that shoulder my body. I am awake. What would cheer one up is not so much for this moment to remain fixed and forever, as when one gazes at a solemn landscape or at the moonlight shining serenely on the river, but for life to have been something else, so that this moment would have had for him a different, more recognizable savor. For those who think everything is complex, and thought, no doubt purely for its own pleasure, only complicates things further. But any thinking person has a need to justify his abdication with a vast manifesto of understanding, embellished like the excuses of detail which, when shaken off like earth from a plant, reveals the root of the lie. It weighs on me, this sudden notion of the true nature of my individual being that did nothing but make somnolent journeys between what was felt and what was seen. It weighs on me as if it were a sentence not to death, but to knowledge. There is such a thing as a weariness of the abstract intelligence, which is the most terrible of all wearinesses. It does not weigh on you like physical weariness, nor does it trouble you like a weariness of the emotions. It is the consciousness of the weight of the whole world, an inability in the soul to breathe. The horror that racks me today is at once less noble and more corrosive. It is a wish not to think, a desire never to have been anything, a conscious despair in every cell of my soul. It is a sudden sense of being locked up in an infinite prison. Where can one even think of fleeing if the prison cell is all there is? I never wanted to be understood by other people. To be understood is akin to prostituting oneself. I prefer to be taken seriously as what I am not, and with decency and naturalness to be ignored as a person. Behind all anguish and pain lie certain debilities of the soul. The only people who remain unaware of these are, I believe, those who shrink from human anguish and pain and tactfully conceal from themselves their own tedium. Since in this way they armor themselves against the world, it is not surprising that at some stage in their self-consciousness they feel suddenly crushed by the whole weight of that armor, and life is revealed to them as an anguish in reverse, an absent pain. My desire for perfection should prevent me from ever finishing anything. It should prevent me even from starting. But I forget that, and I do begin. What I achieve is a product not of the application, but of the giving in of the will. I begin because I do not have the strength to think. I finish because I do not have the heart just to abandon it. This book is my cowardice. The reason I so often break off from a thought to insert a description of a landscape, which in some real or imagined way fits in with the general scheme of my impressions, is that the landscape is a door through which I can escape from the knowledge of my own creative impotence. We can never disembark from ourselves. We can never become another person, except by making ourselves other through the sensitive application of our imaginations to ourselves. The true landscapes are those that we ourselves create, because since we are their gods, we see them as they really are, that is, exactly as they were created. I'm not interested in, nor can I truly see, any of the 7 zones of the world. I travel the 8th zone, which is my own. Someone who has sailed every sea has merely sailed through the monotony of himself. I can understand why people incapable of feeling like to travel. Revolutionaries and reformers all make the same mistake. Lacking the power to master and reform their own attitude towards life, which is everything, or their own being, which is almost everything, they escape into wanting to change others and the external world. Every revolutionary, every reformer is an escapee. To fight is proof of one's inability to do battle with oneself. To reform is proof that one is oneself beyond all help. If a man of real sensitivity and correct reasoning feels concerned about the evil and injustice of the world, he naturally seeks to correct it first where it manifests itself close to home, and that, he will find, is in his own being. The task will take him his whole lifetime. It isn't death I want, or life. It's the other thing that shines at the bottom of all longing like a possible diamond in a cave one cannot reach. It's the whole weight and pain of this real and impossible universe, of this sky, of this standard borne by some unknown army, of these colors that grow pale in the fictitious air out of which there emerges in still electric whiteness the imaginary crescent of the moon, silhouetted by distance and indifference. Life, after all, is but one great insomnia, and there is a lucid half-awakeness about everything we think or do. Today's vague tragedy interrupts what should be the automatic process of drawing up accounts with meditations that I have to struggle to suppress. The only way I can find the heart to work is by turning myself, through active inertia, into my own slave. Provided it comes also from the intellect and isn't pure emotion, there is no truly deep-seated affliction that won't succumb to the ironic cure of being written about. Direct experience is the subterfuge, the hiding place, of those devoid of imagination. What is an ideal but an admission that life is not good enough? What is art but the denial of life? Art serves as an outlet for the sensitivity that action had to leave behind. Every man of action is essentially positive and optimistic because those who don't feel are happy. You can tell a man of action because he's never in a bad mood. The man who works despite his bad mood is a subsidiary of action. If I were actually to fulfill a dream, I would be jealous of it, because it would have betrayed me by allowing itself to be fulfilled. How good to be all alone, to be able to talk out loud to ourselves, to walk with nobody's eyes on us, to lean back and daydream with no interruptions. Every house becomes a meadow. Every room takes on the amplitude of a country villa. All the sounds one hears seem to come from somewhere else, as if they belong to a nearby but independent universe. We are, at last, kings. To consider our anguish an incident of no importance, not just in terms of the life of the universe, but in terms of our own souls, is the beginning of knowledge. To reflect on this while in the midst of that anguish is the whole of knowledge. When we suffer, human pain seems infinite. But not even human pain is infinite, because nothing human is infinite, nor is our pain ever anything more than a pain that we have. How often weighed down by a tedium that verges on madness, or an anguish that seems to go beyond all anguish, do I stop and hesitate before I rebel? Do I hesitate and stop before making myself a god? The pain of not understanding the mystery of life, the pain of being unloved, the pain of others' injustice to us, the pain of life crushing us, suffocating and imprisoning us, the pain of a toothache, of pinching shoes. Who can say which pain he finds the worse, let alone which is worse for others, or worse for others in general? Not to be, but to think, that is the true throne. Not to want, but to desire, that is the crown. Whatever we renounce, we preserve intact in our dreams, eternally bathed in the sun that does not exist, or the moon that will never exist. These have all been excerpts from the Book of Disquiet I found bite-sized enough to include in this book-ending narration, but so many of the longer passages of this book need to be represented. And so here on screen are my favorite individual passages of the Book of Disquiet, which I hope you find as equally resonant as I did. I could read this book out loud to you for days and days. Such is the depth of its insight and poetry. I hope that you choose to pick this up for yourself. Thank you for watching.